This is a wonderful occasion to hear Susan Knabe, Professor Susan Knabe for Women's Studies and the Faculty of Information and Media Technology.
No. The Faculty of Information and Media Studies. FIMS.
We always call it FIMS.
FIMS.
So, actually I have to unravel this. Susan is a beloved professor in our department. She has an amazing array of specialties. Not only does she do sexuality studies, she also does health studies. She has an expertise in Holocaust studies, and yes, and queer studies. Today she is also our expert in names. She comes up with the best names, and once again, she has a fabulous name for us. So today she's going to speak to us on Fun, Feisty, Feminist, WTF, which stands for, again,
where are the French fries? Fill in the blank.
So I'm going to pass the floor over to Susan, and I would hope that you will join me in welcoming her.
All right. Thanks a lot, Helen, for that lovely introduction. And thank you all for being here tonight. Actually, it's wonderful to look out and not only see so many faces, but see so many familiar faces and people who I would soon like to meet afterwards, perhaps, so we can have a nice chat. So I want to actually start by acknowledging that this talk is taking place on the traditional lands of the neutral people. I would like to thank Joe Jennings and the Faculty of Arts and Humanities and the London Public Library. And so without further ado, let me talk a little bit about Fun, Feisty, Feminist, WTF. And as you're going to be going through the talk with me, you're probably going to be wondering WTF from time to time. So in putting my title together, I wanted to signal a couple of things that I see as increasingly important in relation to contemporary feminist activism. Firstly, I wanted to overtly indicate that any engagement with feminist practice in the early 21st century must address the ease with which feminist language, principles, and activism has been co-opted and retreaded in ways which serve the marketplace and not feminist or women's needs or interest. Okay, some of you who maybe were alive as I was in the 1970s will recognize the Virginia Slims ads, the notorious Virginia Slims ads. So Virginia Slims, which is a tobacco company, was perhaps the first of these ads that was retreading feminist language, asserting "you've come a long way, baby," and playing up that distance in the historical vignettes that accompanied the ads. And usually along the top of the ads, there was a historical vignette with something that happens to a woman who is asserting her rights, mostly her right to smoke, and then, "you've come a long way, baby." So this distance between the historical vignettes that accompanied the ads, though I would say certainly both the baby and the trite dismissal of women's historical struggles facilitate the facile and cynical use of an appeal to women's lib, as it was known in those days, to merely build market share. The appropriation or co-optation is not always this easily dismissed, however, particularly when it is sutured to specific causes and identities in ways that are either difficult to recognize or difficult to refute, and I'll show you some examples later on, but a quick example here might suffice. International Women's Day is about a month away, on March 8th. Last year, if you Googled International Women's Day, or IWD, the first hit was the whole web thing, .com, sponsored by Scotiabank Alliance and other corporate sponsors, including Cosmo and Enterprise Rent-A-Car. Helpful. So this is actually a screen grab from that. This is a screen grab from the Cosmo link, which includes an F-word testimonial video, and wait for it, a t-shirt campaign proclaiming "I use the F-word." Many of us know the F word as feminism, right? In some ways, this is not that very different from "This is what a feminist looks like" t-shirts that the Women's Issues Network at UWO has been selling for years. And this is, this is actually an image of Tracy Isaacs, our former chair, modeling one of those shirts on your left. My left, your right. And yet, is it churlish of me to quibble about IWD.com or to find the repackaging of the F word as ultimately a slogan for Cosmo, where, given the nature of the articles, there are many more likely candidates for the F than feminism or feminist? And I'm sure you can think of a few, though Cosmo's own marketing suggests a couple more when profiling their reader as fun, feisty, and knows what she wants. My title, in a way, is an attempt to call into question the way in which feminist language, attitude, and inclinations get drawn in as grist for the mill of capitalism, repackaged and sold back to us as a kind of limited choice. Rosgill's work on sexualization and the midriff figure from advertising is salient here. The midriff, and I'm just going to go. This is a Wonder Bra ad from the early to mid 1990s, will serve as an example, is presented in advertising as an avatar for a particular kind of female empowerment, ostensibly in control of her sexuality, albeit augmented with everything from, as you see here, lingerie to sex toys. She is able to use it in a way to access power. While it starts out promisingly, since it is difficult to imagine how anyone in this day and age would object to women's control over and pleasure in their own sexuality, except, wait, the female sexuality that is on show here, once again, one that ultimately is about appearing rather than feeling, and reiterates established tropes which equate a woman's worth with her ability to fit into a narrow standard of conventional attractiveness. If you think about the Linda Evangelista and the Wonder Bra ad, the choice here is not about an unlimited range of sexualities, nor is it available to women regardless of age, ability, orientation, race, size, etc. The ethos of advertising, however, recruits all of us into participating in the fun of consuming, or at least requires that we sublimate our justifiable anger into some form of economic activity. Run for the cure, anyone? In spite of the challenging criticisms of feminism that suggest it is without either a sense of humor or relevance in the face of post-feminist assumptions, the rhetoric, after all, women are equal, and if so, what is there left to fight for? I want to make a case for taking back both fun and feminism, and for recognizing anger and rage as important animating principles. I want to think about how we might do this through culture jamming principles, like detournement, that is from the situationist notion of turning something on its head or turning it around, turning back on itself the tools and tropes of media and capitalism. I also want to suggest that feminists have been culture jamming for a very long time, and that more than ever, this is an important strategy. I'll finish up by talking about a couple of very contemporary examples, but first I want to talk a little bit about what is at stake. One of the things that I struggle with when teaching women's studies and sexuality studies is how to keep teaching relevant to our students, and how to recognize that the world in which I came out into as both as a lesbian and as a feminist in the 1980s is very patently not the world I live in now, and it is not the world that many of my students are coming out into as feminists. This is a tricky thing to negotiate. How much history is too much history? What happens when the issues and examples we use in lectures are ones that our students can undermine with a click of a mouse, or apparently think they can undermine with a click of a mouse? Just because things have changed in some, often quite fundamental ways, doesn't necessarily mean that they have improved, or that there is nothing left to fight for. So I want us as feminist educators, and I encourage all of you to be feminist educators, just think of the dinner table as your classroom, to recognize that we may need to create different kinds of spaces in which this education might take place. And by this I mean that the strategies of simply exposing the harm that has accrued to women historically and which continues to accrue, and expecting that this is sufficient to bring about change, either in terms of policy or in terms of personal practice, is not necessarily effective. This is borne out in relation to the trajectory of early improvements in the wake of the women's liberation movement, and then the plateauing during the 1990s and the noughties of many of these markers: income, education, participation in the professions, etc. I'm not saying that we should not or do not need to make these things apparent to our students. In fact, we most certainly do, and perhaps even more so now, when it is so easy to gesture towards some aspect of popular culture as a kind of denial of this history. Instead, I want to think about some of the ways that deploying that knowledge or framing that knowledge might foster a different response. One of the problematic aspects of a paranoid disclosure of harm or injury is the tendency to assume a stance and counter-stance positioning, either a victim or perpetrator. This works against broader understandings of the issues and a broader more coalitional approach to tackling these issues. In short, it does not help to build alliances or to generate an understanding, particularly among women and men who might be discursively aligned with perpetrators of harm rather than with so-called innocent victims. Donna Haraway's work on situated knowledges is exemplary here. She asserts that none of us occupy wholly innocent positions, and that we need to recognize that our vision is embodied in ways that allow for seeing together, but not seeing as. This is a powerful metaphor, and one that I think might be usefully deployed in relation to how we talk about feminism, women's rights and issues, especially to folks who might not necessarily have drunk the F-word Kool-Aid yet. Instead, I argue that it might be useful to think about women's oppression and the role of feminism as a story, and then considering how we tell that story using a comedic rather than a tragic frame. While tragedy endeavors to identify and cast out through scapegoating and punishment that which is disruptive or harmful to a given society or population, a comedic frame seeks to educate through humility, inclusivity, and a recognition and correction of common failings and errors. I think this is potentially a productive space in which to encourage feminist conversations, which is another Haraway metaphor, and one that feminist culture jamming might productively contribute to. In the next section of my talk, I want to come back to the issue of fun and the way in which I think it is a necessary element of contemporary feminist educational practice. I just finished talking about comedic frames, which are really not about laughter. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the way in which fun itself has been appropriated and what is at stake there. Asa Wetterngren, in a paper on fun and culture jamming in Late Capitalism, notes that the contemporary marketing strategies rely on a particular management of our affective, interpersonal, emotional lives, what she calls the emotional regime of late capitalism. This includes an increasing reliance on an exploitation of emotional labor. In particular, our emotions are channeled in ways that are good for business, namely that we associate particular emotions with consumption. This emotional regime both favors a cool, detached niceness that is conducive to business, the have a nice day, as papering over anger, boredom, resentment, and recruits us into consumption through an imperative to have fun. As Bourdieu and others have noted, the contemporary middle class are carriers of a fun ethic, a morality of pleasure as duty. This doctrine makes it a failure, a threat to self-esteem, not to have fun. Pleasure is not permitted, but demanded on ethical grounds, and that's the end of the quote from Bourdieu. Moreover, as Wetterngren suggests, the notions of fun and amusement conceal the fact that a whole range of feelings that are strictly controlled in everyday life may be experienced vicariously through consumption, and that consumption helps us sustain the level of self-discipline in everyday life. in a society where niceness is highly valued and very functional for the economy, anger becomes the hidden demon. Wettringen then considers the importance of fun and laughter in terms of how culture jamming functions. Anti-corporate activism, yeah, got those at the bottom there. Anti-corporate activism, which targets the central symbols of consumption, logos, and we see the jam on Esso with the two S's turned into dollar signs, ads, brands, objects, and many of you sort of have seen examples of culture jamming around, and repurposes them in ways that both effects a critique and asserts its possibility. And I included the other culture jam, which is the jam of the yellow ribbon, which has the text on it, question war, to think about how culture jamming might work also in terms of other kinds of ideological productions. So as I say, while Wettringen focuses on anti-corporate activism, I want to consider how thinking about feminist practice in terms of culture jamming might enable us to name and identify the role laughter and fun have played and continue to play in feminist organizing and participation. Okay. When I suggested the reworking of particular feminist narratives in relation to a comedic rather than tragic frame, I also, was in part thinking about the way in which historically laughter offered a kind of utopian possibility, wherein it enabled the negation of a pre-existing order, often within a safe space like the carnival or Saturnalia, but also offered the promise of a new beginning. A way of opening up the present and showing that another world is possible. The aspects that I think of are particular importance include the way that fun operates as a kind of hinge to forge a relationship between the individual and the collective, and the way in which anger can be channeled into funny protest. Both aspects have salience for feminist organizing and are reflected in some of the ways that feminist culture jamming has occurred historically. And both aspects rely on and recognize the way in which feminist protest is embodied and taking place within what is deemed public space. So I'm going to start with the suffragettes. Okay. So this is these are actually covers from suffragette papers, newspapers and magazines, the Votes for Women and I'm just drawing a blank on it now. Come to me in a little bit. Let me call on Catherine to help me out if I can't remember. The social and political union, women's, the WSPU, okay. Yeah, it's right behind me. Okay, I can't see it though. All right. In her book, The Spectacle of Women, Imagery of the Suffrage Campaign 1907 to 1914, Lisa Tickner notes that the suffragettes, that is women working for the vote in the UK, the US, and Canada, utilized the importance of symbols and symbolic protest in their campaigns as a way to convey emotion and draw attention to the specific issues affecting women. In particular, they used pictorial leaflets, cartoons, posters, postcards, processions, banners, and this is a quote from her, "Together they made up that agitation by symbol commended by the common cause for its object lessons by sign and emblems and pictures by procession and many other visual and audible displays which could offer an imaginative insight," and this is the point, the imaginative insight into the minds of others and the reconstruction of a suffering that was not felt. An important part of the suffrage movement were public spectacles and marches, including in 1909 a pageant of women's trades pantomime. These marches were replete with banners, bands, and constituted the unprecedented spectacle where crowds gathered to watch women turning themselves into a political force before their very eyes. As Tickner notes, the spectacles functioned in a similar way for the women participating in the marches and the political funeral of Emily Davison in the summer of 1913. And Emily Davison actually died when she either leapt in front of or attempted to pin a suffragette rosette to the King's horse during the running of the Grand National. And she was trampled and died and became a martyr for the suffragette cause. Anyways, this is a quote from Trickner. Suffragettes themselves, directly or through their rapidly expanding press, were also part of the audience for suffrage spectacle. They were organized and educated and entertained by it, as the grim endurance of 1907 gave way to reports of excited and triumphant contingents arriving flushed and victorious in Hyde Park or at the Albert Hall. Women experienced their collectivity in the act of presenting it to the public gaze. The suffrage campaign was our Eton, our Oxford, our regiment, our ship, our cricket match, as Rachel Ferguson observed. And this is a quote from Rachel Ferguson, who is a suffragette. For 30 years, I made jokes about the feminine ballot to please men. And one fine day, I found myself at the head of a section surrounded by banners bearing many a strange device, walking down Whitehall and reveling in every minute of it. While Emmeline Pethick Lawrence, one of the WSPU organizers, noted the demonstrations functioned as our education in that living identification of the self with the corporate whole. Before I move on, I just want to say a word or two about embodied protest. Helen McNeil notes that these women put their bodies on the line for their beliefs. In pre-war modernity, both pro- and anti-suffrage groups were heavily engaged in using the female body, that visible and material mark of difference. What the suffragettes did was to materialize that discursive object through their own bodies and publicize that physicality through the WSPU magazines, the ones that I showed you 2 slides ago, Votes for Women and the Suffragette. The symbolic marches soon became a middle ground between the other two more extreme poles, the aggression of property damage and the physical sacrifice of hunger strikers by imprisoned suffragettes. Hunger strikes by imprisoned suffragettes. Forcible feeding created for the horrified public an analogy between political and bodily integrity on the one hand and anti-suffrage policies and physical violation on the other. And this is literally via the nasal rape of the hunger strikers, as you see in the Torturing Women in Prison poster. There were also photographs, actual photographs that were taken. This was drawn from a photograph that circulated in the newspapers and whatnot. So suffrage and suffering were united at the physical level in these representation. The images on this slide are posters produced in support of suffrage and targeting the practice of force-feeding women hunger strikers in prison. And once this practice ceased, the political institutionalization of suffrage breaking through the cat and mouse law, which is the one on my left, references, which allowed for the release of women from prison when they fell ill from hunger strikes. This was done to ensure that the blame for women's deaths could not be ascribed to government, the courts, and the jails, but also encourage their immediate rearrest upon their regaining health. So it was kind of a cat and mouse thing. They waited until women were well enough to be imprisoned again and imprisoned them. They then, had a hunger strike, were released, and so it went back and forth as a kind of cat and mouse game. All right, I want to switch now to a more recent example, which is Greenham Common. Okay, here we are. Some of us will remember Greenham Common. Some will not. Okay. Greenham Common was actually a protest against the housing of nuclear missiles at Greenham Common in just outside of Reading in the UK. And I'll just explain a little more about that. Women who engaged in embodied protest were also epitomized by the women's peace protest at the RAF base in Greenham Common. What was initially a march from Wales and the West Country of the UK to Greenham Common to draw attention to and protest the agreement to house nuclear cruise missiles at Greenham Common, which was brokered between Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, became an almost 20-year occupation of Greenham Common by women from across the UK and abroad. In fact, the last woman left Greenham Common, I think in 2000 or 2001. Like the suffragettes, the women produced their own forms of cultural production, including pamphlets and songs. And there's actually a really good PhD thesis by a woman named Anna Feigenbaum. She's also written some articles. She's from McGill, dealing particularly with the songs and the cultural production from Greenham Common. So they included these songs and various forms of pamphlets and stuff like that. You can see the kind of art that was being done, as well as repurposing the most important symbol of the base and its fence. And in fact, the fence itself was the most important symbol for the women. As we can see in these images, the way in which the women darned the fence. I'm just going to move on to this one. This next one. The way in which the women darned the fence and attached various objects to the fence, deturning it, literally turning the fence against the base, right? They actually had a kind of friendship with the fence. They sometimes cut it apart. And there was one amazing action where, using the code word black sweaters to mean bolt cutters, they actually were able to snip the fence apart in little tiny ways. And then the very end, just remove the most important points. It fell apart. And 9 miles of fence literally fell away, which is really interesting if you think about trying to approach a military base today. There's no way that these women would even get within 5 kilometers of the base, let alone be up close and personal with the fence in the way that they were. So as we can see from these images, the way in which the women darned the fence and attached various objects to the fences made it strange and domestic, sort of a domestication of the fence. The Guardian actually has, if you're interested in this, and I think it's a fascinating piece of women's history actually, the Guardian newspaper has a very good video archive of interviews from Greenham, including some of the songs, as does the Imperial War Museum site in the UK. And so I want to actually read a couple of fairly lengthy paragraphs from one of the interviews with a woman named Ann Pettit, who was a participant in the 1982 Embrace the Base activity. And the Embrace the Base activity actually was women joining hands all the way around the entire, so there's 9 miles of women joining their hands around the base. And there's some photographs of that actually, right? So it's unfortunate you can't see very well. In the first one, you see the women sort of all joined hands, and there you see all of the things that people brought to the things. And I'm going to have a hard time. Every time I read this, I actually tear up. So we're going to see if I'll get through that without crying, just as a way of thinking about the way in which affect is brought forward here. And so she's talking specifically about the Embrace the Base movement, which she says is kind of the zenith or the high point of the whole Greenham Common story. She said, we got to Severn Bridge, which is a service station at the Avon Gorge, and the car park was absolutely jammed with coaches. That whole car park was full of coaches that had come from Devon and Cornwall and all over Wales, the whole of the West Country. The whole of the West Country, women was in these coaches, going down the motorway. All these coaches were full of women waving their suffragette colored ribbons, which were, the colors are green, purple, and white, as you saw in some of the suffragette images. What was so good about that was that it was the extraordinary kind of sort of spirit of it was embrace the base. It was overwhelm this place with our good vibe. It's still a kind of naive, optimistic spirit in a sense. Also, you brought a gift. You brought a gift which symbolized the life. how important life was to you. You brought a gift that was important to you, and it was a gift to the base to symbolize life. So the whole fence was just covered with these, absolutely extraordinary. The whole fence was covered with things. Oopsie. And again, it was this mass of ordinary women. And there was a distance between the way that women who considered themselves feminists viewed this. I remember reading in the Spare Rib a very tut-tutting report of this demonstration about how women had hung pictures of their houses on the fence. You know, oh my goodness, reveling in domesticity, or nappies on the fence. One woman had hung her wedding dress on the fence and left it there. She hung her wedding on the fence and walked away and left it. To me, I just sort of walked around with tears streaming down my face, looking at these things, you know, laughing and crying at the same time. I remember Carmen telling me that she saw a whole beautiful dinner service clipped to the fence, and a lot of things were just left. They were sacrificed. They were left, you know. It was a marvelous day. The whole of that 9-mile fence was covered with these things, or with flowers. Obviously, a lot of paintings, a lot of pictures of babies, a lot of embroidery. Women embroidered, started to embroider the fence and sort of use their own arts in this subversive way. Of course, embroidery became part of the Greenham theme afterwards, and soldiers would become absurdly enraged by the embroidery when women would darn the fence. They'd darn huge areas of it in the following years. You know, darning would become something they would do with all multicolored yarn and everything. They would darn such enormous areas of it that you couldn't see through it. The military would be sent with scissors to cut through these silly little bits of, you have to imagine that, with bits of darning. And then they'd reappear the next morning. And the interviewer asks her what she took, and she says, I took 2 sacks of daffodil bulbs from Pembrokeshire and gave them out, and people planted them, and they still come up every year, you see. Okay, I did make it. All right, so I want to shift gears a little bit again and look at some contemporary examples, okay? So just by way of finishing up, I want to consider how we might think about something like Slut Walk as perhaps a contemporary example of the way in which it's possible to draw on anger and forge it into an effective form of collective action. Like the suffragettes and the Greenham Common women, the women participating in the Slut Walk are buoyed along by both their very real anger and the way in which the larger issues that they are addressing involve them in profound and personal ways, and by a sense of fun and collective spectacle. In doing so, I would argue that this particular culture jam has helped redefine the ways in which rape is talked about, most particularly by moving away from victim blaming, a function of one of the most common rape myths which circulate in our culture, that is, she asked for it, and its corollary, which is how to avoid being raped, to demand instead that the onus be on not raping, something that anti-rape campaigns are increasingly turning towards. So that's one of the sort of contemporary examples, and I think we can talk about this in the Q&A afterwards. The second one I want to look at or talk about is women's health, and I have a couple of possibilities here. Okay, so, and I don't know how well you can see that, but that top thing is a knitted uterus and fallopian tube, okay? All right, so these 2 culture jams are addressing the recent attacks on women's health spearheaded by the religious and political right in the US. And if you'll recall, these will be the guys from slide 7, right? So people like Santorum and Limbaugh and Romney. Okay, while the Facebook and Twitter campaign to give congressmen their own knitted vaginas so that they leave ours alone, offers an amusing intervention. You can also felt cervixes or cervices if you want. You don't have to just knit a vagina, you can also felt a cervix. Works as both a clever reversal, is an amusing intervention into the debate. I think that Senator Turner's detournement of the rhetoric and construction of initiatives targeting women's health works as a very clever reversal. And she's actually, I don't think she's a senator. I think she's a congressperson from Cleveland, last year around this time, she actually put forward a bill suggesting that men seeking treatment for erectile dysfunction need additional medical management. And she helps make apparent both the stakes and the hypocrisy of the current legislation regarding women's reproductive health. Her legislation would include provisions to document that the symptoms were not psychological in nature, and would guide men to make the right decision for their bodies. Physicians would be required to obtain a second opinion from a psychological professional to verify that the patient has a true medical malady before the medication could be prescribed. This is a little quote from her bill. The men in our lives, including the members of the General Assembly, generously devote time to fundamental female reproductive issues. The least we can do is return the favor, Senator Turner said. It's crucial that we take the appropriate steps to shelter vulnerable men from the potential side effects of these drugs. When a man makes a crucial decision about his health and his body, he should be fully aware of the alternate options and lifetime repercussions of that decision. Men will be more easily guided through the process of obtaining treatment for impotence so they can better understand and more effectively address their condition. All right, so you can see how that works as a way to, and there were actually several of these that were mounted over the course of the last year. Senator Turner's is probably one of the pithiest. All right, so I want to end by comparing to, sort of coming full circle back to where I started, which was in some ways thinking about the ways in which it's possible to co-opt feminist language and feminist goals, and sometimes in some of the ways in which it's very difficult to unpack that when we're faced with it. So I'm going to look at this last sort of two examples. Okay, so this is actually another more complex example around women's health is in problematizing the way in which those words from my title get taken up in relation to women's health campaigns. These images are part of the Red Dress campaign sponsored by Basel and targeting women's cardiac health. The website tackles women's health through a health promotion approach, which understands health as a result of individual choices and risks. The link between cause-related marketing, consumption, and particular ideas around gendered risk are apparent with the focus on individual behavior modification, activism through consumption, and provocative and sexually resonant images, including the image at the bottom of the slide, which is of the leg of the woman's leg coming out of the taxi in a high heel pair of red shoes, saying "Death loves the ladies." All right. This is a particularly provocative statement if we are to think about it in relation to another red dress campaign, or should I say, redress campaign. Okay, this is the Red Dress Redress campaign, or art installation by Manitoba artist Jamie Black. Black's Red Dress or Redress art installation, which was mounted at both the University of Alberta and the University of Winnipeg, involves placing red dresses sourced from local donations or thrift stores in various places across the installation site. At the U of A, there were more than 50 dresses, which were raised in conjunction with local First Nations women and their allies. At the University of Winnipeg in 2011, there were over 200 red dresses on campus. Black's red dresses are empty to symbolize the missing and murdered Aboriginal women, more than 500 over the last decade. And in haunting the campus or public spaces, these dresses call attention to women and the conditions under which they were murdered or disappeared. The pun, redress, red dress, makes an explicit link between the legacy of colonial violence and the ways in which First Nations women are placed at risk in our society. Here's how Black talks about the project. I hope that the dresses allow viewers to access a pressing and difficult social issue on an emotional and visceral level. before they put up their guard, before they dismiss. We live in a world where we must make choices about the information we wish to internalize and that which we don't. We develop defenses and ways of deflecting information, emotional barriers. It's really for survival. I think that the symbol of the red dress is both subtle and compelling, and also very, very simple and accessible. People are attracted to the dresses and often connect to them before learning what the project is about, what the dresses represent. When they do ask or find out that the dresses represent missing and murdered Aboriginal women in our country, they are often so overwhelmed. A police officer on a tour of the installation came on a tour of the installation at the University of Winnipeg, and by the end of the tour, he had tears in his eyes, and he shook my hand for a very long time, thanking me for allowing him to understand these women, as loved and valued and missed, and not just as statistics. So as I started this talk by linking it to International Women's Day, which is celebrated and commemorated on March 8th, I want to finish it by reminding people that each year, for the better part of 5 years, there has been a commemoration in a march to remember the murdered and missing Aboriginal women in this country on February 14th, both here in London and across the country. And I just want to end there, and I'm welcome questions, comments, anything you have to say. So thank you for being so attentive.